A son of a millionaire is presumed dead after a boat accident. The day later, the millionaire's wife suddenly receives a call and leaves for the night. When she returns home, the house is filled with crying and screaming because the horizon blazed with streaks of orange and pink, a watercolor sky smudged by the salty breath of the sea. Gulls wheeled lazily overhead, their cries threading through the hum of a beach resort, winding down for the day. A vendor trundled his cart along the boardwalk, its wheels squeaking as he called out, "Ice cream last call," to a scattering of sunburned families. Children darted through the sand, clutching dripping cones, their laughter rising like bubbles before popping against the steady crash of waves. Nicholas shifted in his deck chair, the wicker creaking under his weight, and swirled the amber liquid in his glass. His shoulders, red from too much sun, slumped as he exhaled. A long, slow breath that carried the weight of a man who'd finally let the day's edges soften. Beside him, Helena knelt on the sand, tugging at the corners of a picnic blanket that refused to lie flat. Her hair, long brown hair not like middle-aged woman, fluttered in the breeze, and her eyes flicked toward the pier where their son, Eric, bounded toward a small tourist boat. "Eric, slow down," she called, her voice sharp, but laced with a mother's reluctant smile. "You've got your life jacket, right?" He turned mid-stride, all 13 years of him caught in a gangly blur, and flashed a grin. "Yeah, Mum, I'm good." The boat's horn blared, a low, brassy note that rolled across the water, and he scrambled aboard, disappearing into a cluster of kids waving at the shore. Nicholas chuckled, the sound rumbling low in his chest, and reached for her hand. "He's fine, Helena. Let the kid have his fun." His fingers brushed hers, warm and calloused, before he settled back, tipping the glass to his lips. She sighed, smoothing the blanket one last time, though her gaze lingered on the boat as it chugged away, its silhouette shrinking against the fiery sky. "I just worry, you know. He's so fearless." "Like his dad," Nicholas said, smirking into his drink. "Fearless and a little sunburned." The resort buzzed around them, vendors packing up, a toddler wailing as his kite tangled in a palm tree, a couple snapping photos by the water's edge. Time stretched, lazy and golden, until a shadow fell across the blanket. Helena looked up, squinting, as a Coast Guard officer approached, his boots thudding on the sand. His face was carved with lines too deep for a summer evening, and his radio crackled, spitting static into the air. "Mr. and Mrs. Callahan." His voice was clipped, each word a stone dropping into still water. Nicholas set his glass down, the ice clinking, and straightened. "That's us. What's going on?" The officer hesitated, his eyes darting to the sea before settling on them. "There's been an incident. The boat your son was on. It hit a swell, went down fast. We're searching, but no survivors yet." Helena's hands flew to her mouth, the blanket slipping from her grasp, crumpling into the sand. "What do you mean, went down? He's out there. He was just out there." "We're doing everything we can," the officer said, his tone flat, practiced. "Rescue boats are on it. I'll keep you posted." Nicholas lurched to his feet, the chair tipping back, his drink splashing across the sand in a dark stain. "No survivors yet? What the hell does that mean? You're telling me my kids—" He grabbed the officer's arm, his knuckles whitening. "Tell me you've got something. Anything." The man pulled back gently, shaking his head. "I don't have more right now. I'm sorry." Helena's breath hitched, a sound caught between a gasp and a sob, and she stumbled toward the pier, her sandals sinking into the soft earth. "Eric, he's still out there. He has to be." Her voice cracked, fraying at the edges as she scanned the horizon where the boat had vanished. Nicholas followed, his steps heavy, and stopped beside her, staring at the same empty stretch of water. "They'll find him," he muttered, though his jaw tightened, betraying the doubt creeping in. "They have to." Around them, the crowd shifted, vacationers pausing mid-step, their murmurs swelling like the tide. A woman yanked her son closer, her eyes wide. A child's cry pierced the air, sharp and fleeting. The vendor stopped his cart, his shout dying on his lips as he watched the couple, frozen against the pier's railing. Helena turned to Nicholas, her fingers clutching his sleeve, her voice trembling but fierce. "He's not gone. You hear me?" "He's not." Nicholas nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the sea, where rescue lights flickered faintly, swallowed by the dusk. "I know," he said, but the words felt hollow, slipping away like the tide pulling back from the shore. The waves kept crashing, relentless and indifferent, as the sky darkened, brushing the last traces of orange into shadow. Somewhere beyond the pier, a horn sounded, distant, mournful, and the world tilted, leaving them teetering on the edge of a night that promised no answers. A lone fisherman trudged along the shoreline, his rubber boots sinking into the wet sand as the tide retreated, leaving behind a glistening trail of seaweed and broken shells. The sky hung low, grey as an old dishcloth, and the air carried the sharp tang of salt and damp wood. His net, slung over his shoulder, dripped steadily, each drop a soft plink against the quiet, a rhythm broken only by the faint buzz of a helicopter circling somewhere beyond the mist. Nearby, a gull pecked at a discarded sandwich crust, its beak tapping the pier's weathered planks, while the resort lay hushed, its lights dimmed like a town holding its breath. Helena stood at the pier's edge, her toes curling inside sodden sandals, the cold water lapping at her ankles as if testing her resolve. In her hands, she clutched Eric's life jacket, torn at the strap, its orange fabric faded and crusted with salt. She pressed it tighter to her chest, her knuckles whitening, and stared out at the sea, where the waves rolled in with a dull, relentless murmur. Nicholas paced a few feet away, his sneakers scuffing against the gritty wood, until he stopped abruptly and kicked a splintered plank. It skittered across the pier, clattering against a rusted bollard, and he swore under his breath, his fists clenching until the veins bulged beneath his sunburned skin. "Damn Coast Guard," he muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "What's the point of them if they can't even—" "They're still looking," Helena cut in, her tone sharp but trembling, as she turned her head just enough to catch his silhouette against the grey dawn. "They have to be." He snorted, a bitter sound that hung between them, and sank onto a bench, its paint peeling in long, curling strips. "Looking doesn't mean finding, Helena. You heard the guy last night. No survivors yet. What's that supposed to mean for us?" She stepped closer, the life jacket creaking in her grip, and reached for his shoulder, her fingers hovering over the faded cotton of his shirt. "It means there's still a chance. Eric's a fighter. He's out there, Nick." He shrugged her off, the motion quick and jagged, and propped his elbows on his knees, his head dropping into his hands. "A chance? You think that's enough? The boat's matchsticks now, and they're telling us to sit here and wait." Helena's hand fell to her side, her nails digging into her palm, and she turned back to the water, her breath catching in her throat, a small ragged sound she couldn't stifle. "I can't just give up," she said, her voice softer now, fraying like a rope stretched too thin. "He's our boy." Nicholas didn't answer, his shoulders hunching as he stared at the pier's warped boards, where a faint stain of his spilled drink from the night before lingered, dark and sticky. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until the fisherman's net dragged closer, his slow steps a muted scrape against the sand. "You think I'm giving up?" Nicholas said at last, his head lifting just enough to meet her gaze, his eyes bloodshot and shadowed. "I'm not. I don't know what to do with this." Helena swallowed, her throat tight, and glanced down at the life jacket, tracing the jagged tear with her thumb. "Neither do I," she admitted, her words barely above a whisper. "But standing here, holding this, it's all I've got right now." He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to pull the air from the space between them, and rubbed his face with both hands. They should have checked the weather. Somebody should have known that swell was coming. They should have, she agreed, her voice hardening for a moment before softening again. But they didn't. And now we're the ones picking up the pieces. The fisherman paused nearby, his net sagging as he shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and resumed his work, hauling the ropes with a grunt. Around them, a few stragglers lingered on the pier, their faces etched with quiet pity. A woman in a windbreaker whispered to her husband, her eyes darting toward Helena before sliding away. The helicopter's drone faded, swallowed by the mist, and the sea kept its secrets, offering no answers. Nicholas stood, his knees cracking as he straightened, and stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, just enough to feel real. "What if they don't find him?" he asked, his voice low, cracking at the edges like dry timber. Helena didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first faint light struggled to pierce the grey. "Then we keep looking ourselves," she said, her fingers tightening around the life jacket, "because that's what parents do." He nodded, a small, tired motion, and they stood there, side by side, as the waves lapped at the pier's pilings, each swell a heartbeat in the stillness. The fisherman trudged on, his silhouette blurring into the dawn, and the world felt vast and empty, a hollow shore stretching beyond their reach. Rain slapped against the sea in a relentless hiss, turning the surface into a churning quilt of grey and white. A lone buoy bobbed in the distance, its bell clanging faintly, a mournful toll swallowed by the storm's roar. Thunder grumbled overhead, low and rolling, as if the sky itself were shifting restless bones. Lightning flickered, briefly illuminating a jagged horizon where waves clashed like fists, and the wind howled through the emptiness, carrying the scent of salt and something older, wilder. Jacob braced himself on the deck of his rickety fishing boat, his boots sliding against the slick planks as the vessel pitched with each swell. His hands, gnarled and spotted from 70 years of sun and sea, gripped the net's coarse ropes, pulling with a strength that belied his age. The boat groaned under the strain, its timbers creaking as he hauled the load aboard, water streaming from the mesh in silver ribbons. Something heavy caught, and he grunted, leaning in. A soaked figure tumbled out, limp and tangled, onto the deck. "Hey now," Jacob rasped, dropping to one knee, his breath puffing white in the cold. He peeled back the net, revealing Eric, his face pale as driftwood, chest shuddering with shallow coughs. "You're a damn stubborn one, aren't you?" The boy's eyes fluttered, his lips parting as he wheezed. "Mom!" The word was a thread, barely there, lost in the rain's drumbeat. Jacob didn't pause, his hands already moving, rough but sure, as he dragged a tarp from a crate and wrapped it around Eric's shivering frame. "Save your breath, kid," he muttered, hooking an arm under the boy's shoulders and half carrying, half pulling him below deck. The cabin smelled of damp wood and kerosene, its single bunk sagging under a thin blanket. He eased Eric down, the tarp crunching, and turned to the small stove, striking a match with trembling fingers until a flame sputtered to life. "Are you still with me?" Jacob asked, glancing back as he filled a tin cup from a dented canteen, the water sloshing with the boat's sway. Eric's head lolled, but he managed a faint nod, his teeth chattering as he curled tighter into the tarp. Where am I?" "On my boat, and that's all you need to know for now," Jacob said, his voice gruff but steady as he knelt beside the bunk and pressed the cup to Eric's lips. "Drink this, slow, or you'll choke." The boy's hands shook, fumbling against the tin, and Jacob steadied them, his calloused fingers closing over Eric's icy ones. "Easy," he said, softer this time, watching as Eric sipped, his coughs easing into ragged breaths. "Sea spit you out for a reason, I reckon." Eric swallowed, his eyes darting around the dim cabin, the rusted lantern swaying, the nets piled in a corner, before settling on Jacob's weathered face. You pulled me up." "Didn't have much choice," Jacob replied, leaning back on his heels, his knees creaking as he rose. "You were tangled up like a damn fish. Lucky I didn't toss you back." A ghost of a smile flickered on Eric's lips, gone as quick as it came, and he clutched the tarp closer, his voice small. "My parents. They're going to think I'm—" "Don't start that," Jacob cut in, turning to stoke the stove, the fire's glow casting shadows across his lined cheeks. "You're here breathing. That's what counts." Eric didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the cup still trembling in his hands, and the silence settled between them, broken only by the storm's muted roar outside. Thunder rumbled again, a deep echo that drowned the faint wail of rescue horns in the distance. Sounds Jacob's boat slipped past, unnoticed in the chaos. "You got a name?" Jacob asked after a moment, tossing another stick into the stove, his tone casual but edged with something warmer. "Eric," the boy murmured, his eyes lifting briefly, searching the old man's face as if testing the weight of trust. Jacob nodded, a single dip of his chin, and scratched at his stubbled jaw. "Well, Eric, you stick with me till this blows over. Then we'll figure out what's next." Eric's shoulders eased, just a fraction, and he took another sip, the warmth seeping into his bones as the boat rocked beneath them. "Thanks," he said, the word quiet but firm, like a pebble dropped into still water. "Don't thank me yet," Jacob grunted, though his eyes crinkled at the corners, betraying a flicker of relief. "You're still a hell of a mess." Outside, the rain hammered on, lightning slicing the dark, but below deck, the stove's heat spread, a fragile shield against the storm. Jacob settled onto a crate, watching the boy breathe, and the sea churned on, its secrets held tight. For now. A delivery truck rumbled down the quiet street, its engine coughing as it slowed near the Callahan villa, the driver tossing a newspaper onto the lawn, where it landed with a dull thud among scattered leaves. The late afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched across the manicured grass, their edges blurring as a breeze rustled the branches overhead. A squirrel darted up a trunk, its claws scratching faintly, while a neighbor's wind chime tinkled, a soft, hollow sound that drifted over the fence and faded into the stillness. Beyond the villa's gates, the world moved on, oblivious and distant. Inside, Helena sat hunched on the living room couch, her fingers twisting Eric's baseball cap, the brim worn smooth from years of his sweaty grip. The polished hardwood floor gleamed beneath her, reflecting the shadows that crept longer with each passing minute, and her eyes, glassy and red-rimmed, stared at nothing, lost in the hum of her own thoughts. Nicholas paced near the window, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low growl as he snapped at the search team on the other end. "No, I don't care about your schedules. Get another boat out there now." The door creaked open, and Brittany stepped in, her arms balancing a tray of sandwiches, crusts trimmed, neatly stacked, setting it down on the coffee table with a soft clink of porcelain. Her footsteps were light, deliberate, and she paused beside Helena, resting a hand on her knee, her fingers cool against the denim. "You should eat something," she said, her voice gentle but firm, carrying the weight of someone used to being heard. Helena stiffened, her shoulders tightening under her sweater, but she didn't pull away, her gaze flicking to the tray before drifting back to the cap. "I'm not hungry," she murmured, her words slow, fraying at the edges, as if each syllable cost her something she couldn't spare. Brittany sighed, a small sound that hung in the air, and straightened, brushing her hands on her slacks. "You can't keep going like this, Helena. It's been 2 days." "Don't," Helena cut in, her voice sharpening for a moment before softening again, her fingers curling tighter around the cap. "Don't tell me what I can't do." Nicholas slammed the phone down on the windowsill, the clatter echoing through the room, and turned, his jaw tight. "They're sending another crew at dawn," he said, his tone clipped, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of exhaustion. "Said the storm's messing with their signals." Helena's head lifted, her breath catching as she met his gaze across the room. "Dawn? That's too late. He's out there now, Nick. Alone. Cold. He's not alone, Nicholas snapped, his hands shoving into his pockets, though his voice wavered, cracking like thin ice. They've got people looking. We've got people. Samuel slipped in behind Brittany, his small frame dwarfed by the doorway, clutching a sketch pad against his chest, the pencil in his hand dangling unused. He edged closer to Nicholas, his sneakers scuffing the floor, and held up the drawing, a rough sketch of a boat, its lines shaky but deliberate. I made this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes wide and searching. For Eric. Nicholas glanced down, his brow furrowing, and waved a hand, turning back to the window. Not now, Sam, he muttered, his shoulders hunching as he stared out at the fading light, the pines swaying beyond the glass. Samuel's face fell, his arms dropping, and he shuffled back to Brittany, pressing himself against her side, the sketchpad crumpling slightly under his grip. She rested a hand on his head, her fingers threading through his dark hair, and shot Nicholas a look, sharp, fleeting, before turning to Helena. He's just trying to help, she said, her tone measured, though a hint of reproach lingered. I know, Helena replied, her voice flat, almost detached, as she smoothed the cap's brim with her thumb, her eyes drifting to Samuel's slumped figure. But it doesn't change anything. Nicholas exhaled, a long, ragged breath that seemed to pull the room tighter, and rubbed the back of his neck, his knuckles whitening. None of this changes anything, he said, his words heavy, sinking into the silence. We're still here, waiting. Brittany nodded, stepping back to the tray and picked up a sandwich, holding it out to Helena again, her expression softening. Just one bite, she coaxed, her voice low, insistent. For me. Helena hesitated, her fingers pausing on the cap, then took it, holding it without eating, her gaze dropping to the floor. Fine, she whispered, though the word felt like a surrender, small and brittle. Outside, a neighbor approached the doorstep, her arms cradling a bouquet of daisies, and knocked softly, the sound muffled through the thick door. No one answered, and she set the flowers down, their petals already wilting in the cooling air, before retreating down the path. Inside, the room grew quieter, the shadows deeper, and the weight of loss settled like dust, unseen, unfelt, but everywhere. A sparrow perched on the villa's gutter, its tiny claws scratching against the metal as dusk settled over the street, painting the sky in bruised purples and fading golds. The bird tilted its head, peering at its reflection in a rain-streaked window, then flitted away, wings slicing through the cooling air. Downstairs, the neighbors' daisies drooped on the doorstep, their stems bowing under the weight of evening dew, and a distant lawnmower hummed, its sound a faint thread weaving through the quiet. The world outside leaned into night, steady and unhurried, as if time could still afford to linger. Inside, Helena slipped into Eric's bedroom, her bare feet brushing the hardwood with a whisper, the door easing shut behind her with a soft click. Dust motes floated in the slanted light spilling through the blinds, catching on her sweater as she moved past shelves lined with his model ships, each one a memory of his small, careful hands gluing masts and sails. She paused, her fingers trailing over a schooner's deck, the wood cool and smooth, then drifted to the nightstand, where a brass key glinted among crumpled gum wrappers and a half-read comic. "You'd hate me messing with your stuff," she murmured, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the stillness as she palmed the key and turned it in the lock. The bolt slid home with a sharp clack, and she leaned against the door, her forehead pressing into the wood, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. "But I can't let it go yet." The room held her there, wrapped in its silence, until the weight grew too heavy, nudging her toward the hall. Brittany holds all the keys to this mansion. Helena needs to lock Eric's room. No one can break in. She crept downstairs, past the living room where Nicholas's voice rumbled faintly through the walls, and paused outside Brittany's room, a sparse space tucked near the kitchen, its door ajar. The bed was neatly made, corners tucked tight, and a single lamp cast a warm pool over a desk cluttered with receipts and a sewing kit. Helena nudged the drawer open, her fingers sifting through pens and hair ties until they brushed something solid, a thick, dog-eared manual. "What's this doing here?" she whispered, pulling it free, her hands trembling as she flipped the cover. Boat-building basics. Her breath caught, sharp and sudden, as she turned the pages, landing on a diagram. A small tourist boat, its lines eerily familiar, matching the one Eric had boarded. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing, and she traced the sketch with a fingertip, the paper crinkling under her touch. "Helena." Nicholas's voice cut through from downstairs, rough and edged with frustration, followed by the slam of the phone against the counter, a dead-end lead, another thread snapped. "They've got nothing. Again." She froze, the book half open, and shoved it into her bag, the zipper snagging as she forced it shut. "I'm up here," she called back, her tone steady despite the pulse hammering in her throat as she stepped into the hall, smoothing her sweater with unsteady hands. "Just checking something." Nicholas appeared at the foot of the stairs, his shirt rumpled, his face shadowed with stubble. "Checking what?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he climbed a step, his voice thick with exhaustion and something sharper. Doubt, maybe. "The windows," she lied, her fingers curling around the bag's strap, the weight of the manual pressing against her hip. "Thought I heard a draft." He squinted, his head tilting as if weighing her words, then shrugged, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. "No point in that. House could fall apart, and I wouldn't notice right now." Helena forced a nod, her lips pressing into a thin line, and leaned against the wall, her gaze drifting to Brittany's door, still ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling out. "You think she's asleep?" she asked, her voice casual, though her knuckles whitened on the strap. "Brittany?" Nicholas glanced toward the kitchen, where the faint clatter of dishes drifted through. "Nah, she's cleaning up. Said Samuel's already in bed. Poor kid's worn out." "Yeah," Helena murmured, her eyes lingering on the door, her mind spinning around the book's edges, the diagram's precise lines, the coincidence too stark to ignore. "Worn out." Nicholas sighed, a long, bone-weary sound, and turned back downstairs, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. "I'm making coffee," he said over his shoulder, his voice flat. "You want some?" "In a minute," she replied, her words soft but firm, as she slipped the bag higher on her shoulder, the manual's weight a silent question burning beneath her grief. "I've got something to finish first." The hall grew quiet, save for the distant drip of a faucet and Nicholas's muttered curses from the kitchen, and Helena stood there, her breath steadying, her fingers tracing the key still tucked in her pocket. Outside, the sparrow returned, tapping the gutter once more, its reflection a fleeting ghost in the glass. There and gone, like a thought she couldn't yet name. A gull swooped low over the shore, its wings slicing through the morning mist, skimming the water before landing on a weathered post jutting from the sand. The tide ebbed, leaving behind a glistening sheen of shells and tangled kelp, and sunlight glinted off the drying nets strung along Jacob's fence, their knots bleached white by years of salt and wind. A crab scuttled sideways across the damp earth, its claws clicking faintly, while the distant clatter of a fishmonger's cart rolled down the lane, a soft rhythm blending with the sea's steady breath. The world woke slowly, bathed in a fragile calm after the storm's rage. Inside Jacob's seaside shack, Eric perched on a stool, his legs dangling as he peeled a potato, the borrowed sweater swallowing his slight frame, its sleeves bunched at his wrists. His hands shook, the knife wobbling as it carved uneven strips, and a pile of peels grew on the scarred wooden table, curling like fallen leaves. Jacob stood nearby, his back to the boy, sharpening a fillet knife against a whetstone, each stroke a precise hiss that filled the small room with a metallic tang. "Keep it steady," Jacob said, his voice gruff but measured, as he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing at Eric's fumbling grip. "You'll take your thumb off at this rate." Eric paused, the potato slipping in his palm, and frowned, his brow creasing with focus. "It's harder than it looks," he muttered, his tone a mix of frustration and defiance, as he pressed the blade again, nicking his thumb with a sharp wince. Jacob set the whetstone down with a clack, turning fully, and snatched a rag from a hook, his boots thudding against the floorboards. "Told you," he grumbled, wrapping the cloth around Eric's thumb, his rough fingers firm but careful as he tied it off. "Patience, kid. Ain't no rush out here." Eric flexed his hand, the sting fading under the makeshift bandage, and managed a thin smile, his eyes flicking up to meet Jacob's weathered gaze. "You're pretty good at this," he said, his voice soft but steady, a thread of warmth breaking through. "Been patching myself up longer than you've been alive," Jacob replied, sliding a cleaned fish across the table, its scales glinting in the sunlight, streaming through a cracked window. "Try this instead. Less chance of losing a finger." Eric hesitated, his bandaged thumb hovering over the spare knife Jacob nudged toward him, then gripped it, his knuckles whitening as he pressed the blade to the fish's belly. "Like this?" he asked, his voice tentative, glancing at Jacob for approval as the cut wobbled but held. "Close enough," Jacob said, leaning in, his hand guiding Eric's with a slow, deliberate motion, the knife slicing cleaner now. "Let the blade do the work. Don't fight it." He pulled back, folding his arms, and nodded once, a curt tilt of his chin that carried a flicker of pride. Eric's smile widened, faint but real, and he finished the cut, the fish splaying open under his shaky hands. "Not bad, huh?" he said, his tone lifting, a spark of confidence flickering through the exhaustion still clinging to him. "Not bad," Jacob agreed, his lips twitching almost into a grin before he turned to the stove, stoking the coals with a poker. "You got a number for that mom of yours?" "Do you remember one?" Eric's hand stilled, the knife clattering softly against the table, and he looked up, his breath catching as if the question had snagged on something deep. "Yeah," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, his eyes drifting to the window where the nets swayed. "She made me memorize it. Said it was for emergencies." "This qualifies," Jacob replied, his tone dry, but edged with something softer as he wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped toward the door. "I'll borrow a phone from next door. You keep at that fish." Eric nodded, his fingers tightening around the knife again, and resumed cutting, his movements surer now, though his gaze lingered on Jacob's retreating figure. "She's going to be mad I didn't call sooner," he said, half to himself, his voice a mix of worry and relief as he sliced through the scales. "She'll get over it," Jacob called back, his boots crunching on the gravel outside, his silhouette blurring into the morning haze as he trudged toward the neighbor's shack. "Mothers always do." The door swung shut, leaving Eric alone with the hum of the stove and the faint slap of waves against the shore, his hands steadying with each cut, the fish opening like a small victory under his blade. Outside, the gull took flight again, its cry piercing the calm, and Jacob's steps faded down the path, carrying a promise, unspoken but solid, that tethered Eric to the world he'd nearly lost. Do you see Eric's strong will and not complaining about hardships when living with Jacob? If so, leave a comment, takoyaki below. A fisherman's dog trotted along the shore, its paws kicking up damp sand as it nosed a washed-up jellyfish, the morning sun casting a faint halo around its matted fur. Nets swayed on Jacob's fence, glinting in the light, and the sea murmured nearby, a steady whisper against the quiet. Inside the Callahan villa, the phone rang, a shrill pulse cutting through the hum of the refrigerator, and Helena jolted upright from the kitchen table, her coffee mug trembling in her grip, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim onto her knuckles. "Callahan residence," she answered, her voice hoarse, steadying the mug with her other hand as she pressed the receiver to her ear, her breath shallow and quick. A gruff voice crackled through the line, weathered and low. "This Helena Callahan. Got a boy here who says you're his mum. Name's Eric." Her knees buckled, the mug clattering onto the table, and she gripped the counter, her nails digging into the wood. "Eric, where are you? Is he okay?" "Found him tangled in my net," the man, Jacob, replied, his tone blunt but calm, the words grounding her spinning mind. "He's banged up but breathing. I'm down the coast, maybe an hour from the city. Can you come?" "Yes," she said, her voice breaking into a sob, though she swallowed it back, her hand fumbling for her keys on the hook. "Yes, I'm coming. Don't let him out of your sight." "Wasn't planning to," Jacob grunted, the line crackling before he added, "Got a coastal road off the highway. Look for a blue shack. Noon works." "I'll be there," Helena promised, her words firm despite the tremor in her chest, and hung up, her fingers lingering on the phone as if it tethered her to Eric. She glanced toward the living room, where Nicholas slumped on the couch, a whiskey glass dangling from his hand, his snores rumbling faintly. "Nick," she called, her voice soft but urgent, stepping toward him, then stopping as his head lolled, oblivious. "Nick, She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the stairs. Brittany was upstairs, folding laundry, humming faintly, and shook her head, grabbing her coat instead. "I'll tell you later," she whispered, slipping out the door, the lock clicking shut behind her. The rented car's engine sputtered as she pulled onto the coastal road at noon, dust swirling around the tires as she stepped out, her boots crunching gravel. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the waves' crash. Jacob stood by Eric near the shack, the boy bundled in a too-big coat, his face pale but alert, his hair matted with salt. Helena stumbled forward, dropping to her knees before him, and pulled him into a tight embrace, her sobs muffled in his hair, her hands clutching his shoulders as if he might vanish. "Mom," Eric whispered, clinging back, his voice small but steady, his arms wrapping around her neck. "I knew you'd come." "I'd never stop," she choked out, stroking his cheek, her thumb brushing a bruise under his eye, her tears blurring the sight of him, alive, real. "You're here. You're really here." Jacob shifted, his boots scuffing the dirt, and cleared his throat, his hands shoved into his pockets. "He's tougher than he looks," he said, his tone gruff but tinged with something softer as he watched them, his weathered face unreadable. Helena looked up, her eyes glistening, and fumbled in her coat, pressing a crumpled wad of cash into his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick, trembling with gratitude as he pocketed it silently, stepping back. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Keep him safe here a little longer. I need time." Jacob's brow furrowed, but he nodded, a single dip of his chin, his gaze steady. "He'll be fine with me. You do what you have to." Eric pulled back, his hands still gripping her sleeves, and tilted his head, his eyes searching hers. "You're not taking me home?" he asked, his voice quavering, a flicker of confusion crossing his pale face. "Not yet," Helena replied, her tone gentle but firm as she brushed his hair back, her fingers lingering on his forehead. "I've got something to figure out first, okay? You're safe here, I promise." "Okay," he said after a moment, his shoulders easing, though his grip tightened briefly before letting go, trust settling into his quiet nod. A truck rumbled past, its horn blaring, a jarring note that faded into the wind, and Helena stood, dusting her knees, her breath steadying as she met Jacob's eyes again. "I'll be back soon," she said, her words a vow, carrying the weight of secrets yet to unravel. Jacob grunted, turning toward the shack, and Eric followed, glancing back with a small wave. Helena climbed into the car, her hands steady on the wheel, the dust settling behind her as she drove off, relief and resolve warring in her chest, a fragile peace shadowed by questions still unanswered. A moth fluttered against the villa's porch light, its wings tapping a frantic rhythm against the glass, casting fleeting shadows across the steps still damp from an evening drizzle. Inside, the stairs creaked under Helena's quiet tread as she climbed, her boots silent on the carpet, her bag slung over her shoulder, the boat-building manual, a heavy secret pressing against her side. The hall stretched dark and still, save for a sliver of lamplight spilling from the master bedroom, jagged shadows dancing on the walls like broken promises. She will tell her husband about Eric being alive and about her suspicions that Brittany was involved in sabotaging the boat. But, having something in their bedroom, Helena paused at the threshold, her breath catching as Brittany folded a shirt on the bed, her movements precise, the fabric snapping softly with each crease. She ducked behind the door, ear pressed to the wood, her pulse thudding as Brittany's voice drifted out, low and casual. "Samuel's growing so fast, Nick. Looks more like you every day." Nicholas's muffled reply came from the bathroom, water running in the sink. "He's a good kid. Takes after his mum, too." Helena's fists clenched, her nails biting into her palms, and she burst in, the door banging against the wall. "What did you just say? Samuel is the son of my husband," she demanded, her voice sharp, trembling with a fury she couldn't cage, as she stepped forward, her shadow looming over the bed. Brittany froze, a smirk curling her lips, defiant and cold, as she set the shirt down, her eyes locking with Helena's. "You heard me," she said, her tone clipped, unyielding. "He's Nick's son, always has been." Nicholas emerged, a towel slipping from his shoulder, his face paling as he stopped short, water dripping from his hands. "Helena, what the hell?" he stammered, his voice cracking, his eyes darting between them like a trapped animal. "You've been lying to me," Helena snapped, her gaze burning into Brittany, her fists trembling at her sides. "Both of you. And Eric, did you sabotage that boat? Did you try to kill my son?" Brittany's smirk faltered, but she straightened, her chin lifting. "You're reaching," she said, her voice cool, though a flicker of unease crossed her face. "You've got no proof." "Proof?" Helena's voice rose, raw and ragged, as she yanked the manual from her bag, slapping it onto the bed. "This was in your room, same boat Eric was on. Explain that." Nicholas stepped forward, his towel dropping, his hands raised. "Helena, calm down. This doesn't mean—" Samuel stumbled in, sleepy and barefoot, rubbing his eyes, his pajama sleeves slipping as he clutched Helena's leg. "Mrs. Helena, stop yelling. I beg you to forgive my mum," he sobbed, his voice thick with tears, his small hands tugging at her jeans. I saw her do it. She cut something on the boat. I didn't tell because she said I'd lose her. I never think it will be Eric. I cherish him, my best friend. But my mom—" Brittany's face crumpled, her defiance shattering, and she sank onto the bed, her hands trembling as she stared at Samuel. "You weren't supposed to," she whispered, her voice breaking, then lifted her eyes to Helena, resigned. "Fine, I did it. For him. For Samuel's future. Eric was in the way." Helena staggered back, her breath hitching, her hand flying to her mouth as Nicholas reeled, his face ashen, his voice gone. "You, what?" he choked out, his words barely audible, his hands falling limp as he stared at Brittany, the woman he'd trusted, now a stranger. "You heard her," Helena said, her voice low, cutting through the silence like a blade, her eyes blazing as she turned to Nicholas. "Your son with her. She wanted mine dead for it." Brittany shook her head, her hands twisting the shirt, her voice rising in desperation. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to go so far. I just wanted Samuel to have what he deserves." "Deserves?" Helena's laugh was bitter and hollow as she knelt to Samuel, pulling him close, his sobs soaking her sweater. "He deserves a mother who doesn't murder kids to get it." Nicholas sank against the wall, his knees buckling, his breath ragged as he rubbed his face, his voice a whisper. "Brittany, how could you? I didn't know. I swear I didn't." "You didn't ask," Brittany shot back, her tone sharp and brittle, as she stood, her hands balling into fists. "You didn't care enough to see." Helena rose, her arm around Samuel, her eyes locked on Brittany, cold and unyielding. "You're done here," she said, her words a quiet thunder, carrying the weight of betrayal's wreckage. "Both of you." The room fell silent, save for Samuel's sniffles and the moth's faint tapping outside, its wings a ghost against the light. Nicholas stared at the floor, speechless, his world unraveling, while Brittany's shoulders slumped, her confession a stone sinking into the night, irreversible, unforgivable. The dawn's first light brushing the leaves with a pale gold sheen. Inside, the dining room lay in disarray, chairs toppled, a whiskey bottle glinting on the table, while Helena stood by the window, arms crossed, her sweater hanging loose on her frame, her gaze fixed on the garden, tracing the cat's path. Though her mind churned with the night's wreckage, her breath fogging the glass in shallow bursts. Nicholas slumped at the table, unshaven, his shirt crumpled, the bottle's neck clutched in his hand as amber liquid pooled beneath it, staining the wood. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice thick, slurring through the haze of exhaustion and guilt, his eyes avoiding hers. "You've got to believe me, Helena. I didn't know that Brittany hurt our son." She turned, her arms tightening across her chest, her voice low and edged with steel. "You didn't know because you didn't look," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the stale air. "But it's over now. I want a divorce." His head jerked up, his grip faltering, the bottle tipping further. "Divorce? Helena, we can—" "No," she snapped, her tone firm, unyielding as she stepped closer, her shadow falling over him. "And Brittany. She confesses to the police. Today. No contact with Eric and Sam, ever. That's my line, Nick." Brittany emerged from the hall, her hands shaking as she stuffed clothes into a duffel, her hair falling loose over her pale face. "I'll go," she said, her voice brittle, cracking like dry twigs as she zipped the bag with a jerk. "I'll tell them everything. Just don't drag Samuel into it." Helena's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening, but she nodded once, sharp and final. "He won't be," she said, her words cold, carrying the weight of a promise forged in fury. "But you don't get to play the martyr here." Samuel hovered in the doorway, hugging a pillow, his small frame trembling as he watched, his eyes red and swollen. Brittany knelt, kissing his forehead, her lips lingering as she whispered, "I'm taking a trip to earn more money to take care of you better, okay? Mrs. Helena will look after you in this time." "Don't go," he mumbled, clinging to her sleeve, his voice a thin plea, before turning to Helena, his arms wrapping around her leg. "Thanks for not hating me," he said, his words muffled against her jeans, his tears soaking through. Helena's face softened, though her jaw stayed set, and she squeezed his shoulder, her fingers steady despite the ache in her chest. "I don't hate you, Sam," she murmured, her voice gentling, a lifeline in the chaos. "Never will." Nicholas rubbed his face, his breath shuddering, and stood, swaying slightly. "What about Eric?" he asked, his voice raw, searching her eyes for something. Hope, maybe, or forgiveness. "You said no contact, but—" "He's alive," Helena cut in, her tone flat and final as she met his gaze, her arms uncrossing. "That's all you get for now. You don't deserve more." His knees buckled, and he sank back into the chair, speechless, the bottle rolling off the edge with a dull thud. Brittany zipped her bag shut, her shoulders slumping, and slipped past Samuel, her footsteps fading down the hall as police lights flashed silently outside, painting the walls red and blue. Later, at Jacob's shack, the midday sun warmed the nets swaying in the breeze as Eric stood on the beach, his borrowed coat flapping around him. Jacob tossed him a worn ball, its leather cracked and faded, and pointed to the sand. "Go on," he grunted, his voice gruff but warm, as Eric kicked it, his laughter faint but growing, a sound carried on the wind. "Watch your step," Jacob called, steadying Eric as he slipped on wet sand, his gnarled hand firm on the boy's arm until he regained his footing, a grin breaking through. "Not bad," he added, his tone gruff with approval as Eric kicked again, the ball skidding toward the water. Eric glanced up, his breath puffing white in the cool air, his voice lifting. "Think Mum's coming soon?" he asked, his eyes bright, searching Jacob's weathered face for reassurance. "Soon enough," Jacob replied, folding his arms, his gaze steady as he watched the boy play, a fishmonger's shout drifting from the shore. "She's got you covered, kid." Eric nodded, his kicks growing surer, and the ball rolled back to Jacob, who nudged it with his boot, joining the game with a rare, quiet chuckle. The shack loomed behind them, a weathered sentinel, guarding a slow healing that unfurled like the tide, gentle, persistent, and unbroken. A gull perched on a driftwood stump near Jacob's shack, its feathers ruffling as a late afternoon breeze swept over the shore, the tide pooling softly around rocks. Inside the seaside cottage Helena had claimed, a kettle whistled faintly, its steam curling against a cracked window pane, while the faint scent of salt and baked bread drifted from an open door. Helena stepped out to the car, her movements steady, unloading groceries, bags crinkling with apples, a loaf of rye, a jar of jam, her hair tied back in a loose knot, her face softer now, etched with a weary peace. It has been 3 months since the divorce with Nicholas. On the beach, Eric kicked a ball, his sneakers sinking into the sand, his laughter ringing out, faint but growing, as Jacob's old dog bounded after it, its tail a blur of grey. Samuel trailed behind, his steps tentative, the ball skidding past him as he grinned, his small frame dwarfed by the borrowed coat flapping around his knees. "Pass it here," he called, his voice lifting over the waves, his arms outstretched as Eric nudged the ball his way. Helena paused, a bag dangling from her hand, and watched them, her breath catching at the sound, a melody she'd feared lost forever. Eric broke away, running up, his cheeks flushed, and pressed a smooth pebble into her palm. "Found this for you," he said, his tone bright, steady, his eyes searching hers for that old familiar warmth. She tucked it into her pocket, her fingers lingering on its cool edge, and ruffled his hair, her touch gentle but firm. "It's a keeper," she replied, her voice soft, carrying a smile that reached her eyes, a quiet vow stitched into the words. "Just like you." Samuel edged closer, kicking at the sand, and offered a shy wave, his hand half hidden in his sleeve. "Me too?" he asked, his voice small, testing, as if unsure of his place in this fragile new shore. Helena's gaze softened, and she dropped the bag, pulling them both into a quick hug, her arms encircling their shoulders, her sweater brushing their cheeks. "You too, Sam," she said, her words a warm thread binding them, her grip tightening briefly before letting go. "Always." Jacob sat on his porch nearby, his gnarled hands mending a net, the twine slipping through his fingers with practiced ease, his eyes crinkling as he watched the boys play. He set the net aside, rising with a grunt, and shuffled down to the beach, his boots leaving shallow prints. "Try this," he said, picking up a flat stone and handing it to Eric, his voice gruff but warm, as he mimed a flick of the wrist. Eric took it, his brow furrowing, and tossed it toward the waves, the stone skipping once before sinking. "Only one," he groaned, his tone mock-frustrated, though a grin tugged at his lips as he glanced at Jacob. "Better than none," Jacob replied, his lips twitching into a rare half-smile, and handed him another, guiding his arm with a steady hand. "Angle it. There you go." The stone skipped twice, and Eric whooped, his laughter spilling over the shore. Samuel stepped up, clutching a fish Jacob had given him earlier, its scales glinting in the fading light. "Can I try this now?" he asked, his voice eager, his eyes darting between Jacob and the knife on the table. Jacob nodded, sliding the blade across, and steadied Samuel's small hand as he pressed it to the fish, the cut wobbly, but clean. "Not bad, kid," he said, clapping him on the back, his tone gruff with approval, as Samuel beamed, wiping his hands on his coat. Helena watched from the cottage steps, her arms full of groceries, her breath easing as the boys' voices mingled with the sea's murmur, a sound that stitched her fractured world back together, thread by fragile thread. "You're good with them," she called to Jacob, her voice carrying a quiet gratitude, her eyes meeting his across the sand. "Someone's got to be," Jacob grunted, though his gaze softened, a flicker of pride breaking through his weathered mask as he tossed Eric another stone, the boy catching it mid-air. "They're tough nuts, both of them." Eric skipped the stone, 3 bounces this time, and turned to Helena, his grin wide. "See that, Mom?" he shouted, his voice bright, unbroken, a lifeline reaching across the days of loss. "I see it," she replied, her tone steady and warm, as she set the bags down, her hands resting on her hips, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Keep going." Samuel kicked the ball again, the dog barking in chase, and Jacob shuffled back to his porch, his chuckle trailing behind. A fishmonger waved from his stall down the shore, curious but friendly, as the tide rolled in, pooling around rocks, a new shore taking root, bound by small joys and steady hands. Fishermen's skiffs bobbed at the edge of the shore, its hull rocking gently as sunset painted the sea gold, a warm glow spilling over the waves like molten amber. Nets rustled in the breeze near Jacob's shack, their knots swaying like whispers of the day's catch. Inside the cottage, a lamp flickered on, casting a soft halo through the window, while the scent of chamomile tea drifted from the porch, mingling with the salt-laden air. 3 months had passed since the divorce, and the world here felt solid, carved from resilience and time. Helena leaned on the porch railing, a mug of tea steaming in her hands, its warmth seeping into her palms as she gazed at the beach, her sweater loose around her shoulders, her hair catching the last light. Eric and Samuel sprawled on the sand below, their hands busy with a driftwood fort, sticks balanced in a teetering frame, their laughter a soft echo threading through the dusk. Jacob sat nearby on a weathered crate, whittling a piece of wood, his knife flashing silver with each deliberate stroke, his eyes crinkling as he watched them work. "Look at this, Mrs. Helena," Samuel called, his voice bright, rising over the waves' murmur, as he waved her over, his small frame hunched beside the fort, a twig clutched in his hand like a prize. She set the mug down, its base clinking against the rail, and stepped onto the sand, kneeling beside them, her jeans brushing the cool earth. "That's a fortress," she said, her smile soft, genuine, as she added a stick to the structure, steadying it with a gentle press. "You two could hold off a whole army." Eric grinned, nudging a log into place, his fingers sandy and sure. "We'd win too," he said, his tone bold, unbroken, a spark of the boy she'd fought to bring back shining through his words. Jacob shuffled over, his boots crunching, and bent to add a twig to the fort's peak, his grunt easing into a rare chuckle as it held. "Needs a flag," he muttered, his voice gruff but warm, his weathered hands steady, despite the years etched into them. Eric nudged him, his elbow brushing Jacob's arm, and tilted his head, his eyes bright. "Make us one?" he asked, his voice lifting, a quiet challenge wrapped in trust as he watched the old man's hands. Jacob paused, his knife stilling, then carved a small fish from the wood, its fins rough but clear, and handed it to Eric, his fingers brushing the boy's palm. "Stick that on top," he said, his tone dry, though a flicker of pride softened his weathered gaze. "Better than a flag." Eric beamed, showing it off, the fish glinting in the fading light as he balanced it atop the fort. "Check this out, Mom," he called, his voice ringing with a joy that pierced her chest, a sound she'd once feared lost to the sea. "I see it," Helena replied, her tone steady, warm, as she rose, brushing sand from her knees, her eyes lingering on the boys, their fort, their laughter. "It's perfect." Samuel glanced up, his hands stilling on a stick, and offered a shy smile, his voice small but firm. "We're a team, right?" he asked, his eyes darting between her and Eric, searching for a place that now felt like his. "Always," Helena said, her words a quiet anchor, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder, her touch a promise woven from the ashes of betrayal. "You both are." Jacob straightened, his joints creaking, and shuffled back toward his shack, his knife flashing once more as he resumed whittling. Helena followed a step, brushing his arm in thanks, her voice low. "You've done more than you know," she said, her tone thick with gratitude, her eyes meeting his, steady, weathered, kind. "Didn't do much," he grunted, though his lips twitched, a rare softness breaking through as he glanced at the boys, their fort silhouetted against the glowing sea. "They're the ones holding it together." She nodded, her shoulders easing, and returned to the porch, picking up her mug, the tea still warm against her palms. "Maybe," she murmured, her voice a whisper to the wind, her gaze settling on Eric and Samuel as they laughed, their voices blending with the wave's rhythm. Villagers passed by, their figures shadowy in the dusk, nodding warmly as their chatter drifted over. Words of fish prices and weather, a quiet chorus anchoring the shore. Eric waved at them, his carved fish raised high, and Samuel joined, his stick a makeshift sword, their fort standing firm. Helena sipped her tea, the steam curling upward, and felt the horizon steady, a slow, sure promise of renewal etched in sand and held by hands she'd never let go. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.